Sometimes the biggest moves in geopolitics don't come with a press conference, no handshakes, no headlines, no dramatic announcements. They just kind of happen quietly, almost like they're trying not to be noticed. When I first started seeing Japanese investment flowing into Canada, not the usual stuff, but real strategic partnerships, I got that feeling where you realize something important is happening and nobody's really talking about it yet. So here's what we're looking at today. Japan, the world's third largest economy, is making a bet, a massive one. And they're not betting on China or the US or even their traditional partners, they're betting on Canada. And the way they're doing it is so quiet, so deliberate, that most people haven't even noticed that it's happening. We're going to unpack why Japan's planners are looking north, why this caught China completely off guard, and what it actually says about the new rules of global power. Because this is not just about trade deals or minerals, it's about something way more fundamental: trust. Quick question, especially for Canadians watching. If your country suddenly became the linchpin of someone else's entire security strategy, would that feel like a responsibility or an opportunity? Do you even trust your own institutions to handle that kind of weight? Let me know down in the comments below, because I'm genuinely curious what people think about this. Just a quick personal note, my new book, Awake, the Practice of Critical Thinking in an Age of Soft Lies, is finally out in the world now. It's more than just a guide to thinking more clearly. It's about finding calm and clarity in a world that keeps getting louder. If you've ever felt like I do, worn down by the noise and knee-jerk opinions and want practical ways to think things through, especially under pressure, I think you'll find it valuable. Or if you know somebody who could use that kind of support right now, it might actually make a thoughtful Christmas gift. There's also a 24-minute companion podcast that walks through the key ideas, plus a launch video and a special discount for subscribers, all linked down below. And one more thing, maybe you didn't know, but I'm a computer scientist and I have a PhD in the field. I'm working on a new course all about AI fluency, essentially making sense of the technology that's shaping the next decade. If you're interested in this space and want to help guide what I build, I'd love to have your input. There's a quick 8-question survey, just a couple of minutes to fill out, and your thoughts will directly influence the content that I build next. The links to everything are below. It would mean so much to hear from you. Thank you for listening, but now let's get back into it. Here's what's weird about this whole thing. There was no treaty. No big signing ceremony with flags and photographers, no viral moment for the social media. Instead, it started showing up in places most people don't look. Japanese companies started appearing in Canadian research facilities, not as customers, but as partners. Investment partners started shifting. Diplomatic visits started happening, but the boring kind that don't really make the news. And then analysts started connecting the dots. Oh wait, this isn't random. This is actual strategy. Interesting. What Japan is doing is redirecting entire supply chains, repositioning industrial planning, reallocating research budgets. Each move by itself looks small, but when you zoom out, it's a complete strategic realignment. And here's what I think most people are missing. This wasn't a reaction to one crisis. This was Japan looking at the world and going, okay, volatility is the new normal now. We can't just react anymore. We actually need to build for permanent instability. Think about what that means for a country like Japan. You're an island nation. You import almost everything: energy, food, raw minerals, advanced components. Your entire economy depends on supply chains that stretch across the globe. And over the last few years, you've watched those supply chains break down again and again and again. Pandemic shutdowns, geopolitical tensions, natural disasters, trade disputes. Honestly, what is even happening at this point? Every single time, Japan has had to scramble. And Japanese planners looked at that pattern and sort of realized this isn't temporary. This is just what the world looks like now. So they made a calculation. Economic security isn't separate from national security anymore. It's the same thing. And if that's true, then we can't really chase the lower prices or the most convenient partners. We need something else entirely. We need certainty. And that's way, way harder to find than cheap manufacturing, my friends. Okay, so if you're not Canadian or Japanese, when you hear Canada, you probably think hockey, maple syrup, people saying sorry a lot, maybe universal healthcare and cold winters, a lot of snow. But in the context of what Japan needs right now, Canada is something completely different. It's become this rare thing in global politics, a country you can actually count on. And look, Japan didn't just need more minerals. They can get minerals from lots of places. Australia has minerals, Africa has minerals, even the US has plenty of resources. What Japan needed was a partner whose rules wouldn't suddenly change, whose government wouldn't weaponize supply chains when politics got tense, whose legal system actually honors contracts and doesn't shift with every election, whose regulatory environment is transparent enough that you can plan decades ahead. Canada has something most countries don't: boring, predictable institutions. And in a world that's lurching from crisis to crisis like ours, boring is actually incredibly valuable. But it goes even deeper than that. Canada is actually evolving in ways that matter for long-term industrial planning. They're building partnerships with Indigenous communities that create stable community-level buy-in for resource projects. They have environmental regulations that are strict, sure, but they're clear and consistent. Their climate commitments aren't just PR exercises, they're actually backed by policy and infrastructure. And Japanese executives noticed all of this. They started describing Canada as the safest place in the G7 to make 30-year bets. Not the most exciting, not the nicest weather, not the flashiest, but it is the safest. Think about what that means. When you're planning a rare earth processing facility that needs to run for 3 decades, when you're building hydrogen infrastructure that costs billions to establish, when you're restructuring your entire industrial base, you don't want the country with the best sales pitch. You want the country that's still going to have the stable governance in 2050. Canada has clean energy infrastructure at scale, hydropowered industrial processing that doesn't depend on fossil fuels, emerging hydrogen networks that could power the next generation of manufacturing, access to Arctic shipping lanes that climate change is opening up now. But more than any of that, it has something increasingly rare: steadiness under pressure. When COVID hit, for example, Canada's institutions held. When global trade got disrupted, Canadian supply chains adapted. When political tensions rose, Canadian policy remained predictable. In a weird sort of way, Canada's biggest export right now is not lumber or oil or minerals, it's reliability itself. And Japan looked at all of that and basically said, yes, that's exactly what we need. If there is a miscalculation of the story, it actually happened in Beijing, in my opinion. For years, decades really, the assumption was simple and seemingly unbreakable. Japan needs China more than China needs Japan. The sheer scale of Chinese manufacturing, the deep integration of supply chains, the decades of economic ties built up since the 1980s, it all pointed to Japan being permanently locked into the Chinese orbit. Honestly, that logic kind of made perfect sense. Japan imports massive amounts of Chinese goods. Chinese factories are embedded at every level of Japanese supply chains. Chinese markets buy Japanese products. On paper, walking away from that looks not just difficult, but impossible. But here's what China missed, and this is the crucial part. Japan wasn't worried about today. They were running scenarios. What happens in 10 years when China's demographics shift and they prioritize domestic consumption over exports? What happens when geopolitical tensions escalate and China decides to use supply chains as leverage? What happens when Japan suddenly finds itself last in line because Beijing's priorities changed? These are not hypothetical concerns, my friends. Japan watched China restrict rare earth exports in 2010. They watched trade disruptions with Australia. They saw what happened to Lithuania when it angered Beijing. The pattern is clear. Economic ties with China come with political strings attached. So Japan started quietly restructuring, not with announcements or threats or dramatic policy speeches, just redirecting. Less dependence on Chinese manufacturing for critical components, more diversified suppliers for essential materials, strategic redundancy built into every major supply chains. Kind of what Canada is doing right now as well. But here's the key part that changes everything, in my opinion. They didn't just want an alternative, they wanted certainty. Governance they could trust over decades, legal systems that work the same way regardless of politics, democratic institutions that align with their own values and won't suddenly become adversarial. And that is not something China can offer right now, no matter how cheap their manufacturing is or how massive their economy becomes. What really blindsided Beijing wasn't that Japan was diversifying, everyone diversifies. It was the depth of trust Japan had placed in Canada, the scale of the commitment, the long-term all-in nature of the bet. This was not hedging, this was a fundamental reorientation. Because what Japan is signaling to the world is this: we'll take reliability over scale, we'll take trust over price, we'll pay more and wait longer if it means we can count on our partners. And if you're China, that's a much bigger problem than just losing some market share, right? Because now you're watching other countries realize that they have real options, that they can restructure supply chains around democratic partners if they're willing to invest in it, that authoritarian efficiency comes with hidden costs that eventually become unbearable. Here's what's fascinating about how this partnership came together. It wasn't politicians making grand promises at summits. It wasn't trade ministers signing memorandums of understanding for the cameras. It was engineers and specialists sitting in rooms talking about hydrogen infrastructure and semiconductor supply chains and rare earth processing. The boring technical stuff that actually is the backbone of this whole thing. The negotiations happen in labs, as they should in my opinion, in technical forums, in closed-door industry meetings that nobody reported on. Japanese delegations of specialists, not diplomats, specialists, met Canadian counterparts. not to make speeches, but to solve the actual problems. How do we build LNG corridors that work in Arctic conditions? How do we secure rare earth supply without creating environmental disasters? How do we structure these partnerships so that they can survive the next political transition in either country? Canadian diplomats matched that approach perfectly. Low-key, technical, focused on climate standards and regulatory predictability. They were not trying to win headlines. They were literally just trying to build something that works. And over months and years, they constructed something that wasn't a deal, but a framework. Not an event, but an architecture of a kind, a system designed to adapt and endure. And that is the whole point, my friends. Japan and Canada were not trying to impress the world or make a statement. They were building something durable enough to outlast whatever crisis comes next. And I think there's going to be many of those. Look at the actual investments flowing both directions. Joint research projects on clean technology, infrastructure alignments for hydrogen transport, technology pilots for rare earth processing, investment in Canadian mining projects with Japanese expertise. Each one by itself looks modest, almost boring, but together it's actually a complete industrial security system designed specifically to survive volatility. This is what modern alliance building actually looks like. Not flashy summits with photo ops, but patient construction over years, not seeking attention, but seeking endurance. Not optimizing for the next news cycle, but for the next 3 decades. Here's why this matters way beyond just Japan and Canada. When two of the world's most trusted economies build a template for reliable democratic supply chains, other countries pay very close attention. In Europe, for example, policymakers are asking if they can build similar frameworks, ethical supply chains that aren't vulnerable to authoritarian pressure or sudden political shifts. In India, there is serious talk about hydrogen partnerships and chip-making collaborations modeled on what Japan and Canada are doing. Australia is watching this as a part of a wider democratic convergence, a network of countries that share values and can actually trust each other. The old logic was brutally simple, my friends. Whoever controls supply chains controls the future. Whoever can produce the cheapest wins. Efficiency and cost above everything else, but that logic is breaking down in real time now. Now it's whoever builds the most resilient network wins, whoever can guarantee supply through the next crisis, pandemic, war, natural disaster, whatever comes. That's who becomes indispensable. And here's the thing, Japan and Canada aren't telling everyone else what to do. They're not evangelizing or trying to build some kind of alliance structure. They're just demonstrating that it's possible, that you can choose stability over short-term savings, that you can prioritize governance and long-term thinking and still be competitive, that democratic partners can build supply chains that work better precisely because they were built on trust instead of coercion. The global economy is actually transforming underneath all of the headlines about trade wars and deglobalization, not through blockbuster trade deals, but through these kinds of patient technical frameworks. Climate integration that makes clean energy a competitive advantage, strategic de-risking of individual supply chains, long-term partnerships that value reliability as much as efficiency. It's not exciting, it doesn't make for good TV, headlines barely cover it, but it works, and in 5 years and 10 years, this quiet restructuring is actually going to matter far more than any of the loud political battles dominating the news today. And in this environment, reputation isn't just some soft power thing diplomats talk about. It's the most valuable currency there is, because once you lose it, once partners stop trusting that you'll honor the agreement or that your rules won't suddenly change, you can't buy it back at any price. So here we are at the end of a story that barely made the news, but might actually reshape how power works in the 21st century. Japan's pivot to Canada didn't spark outrage or celebration. It was too quiet, too technical, too boring for that. But it raises a question that matters way more than any individual deal. In a world of permanent instability, a perma-crisis, what is trust actually worth? What you believe about this probably says more about how you see the world than about the facts themselves. If you see this as a win for democracy and values-based partnerships, maybe you value stability above everything else. If you see risk, one country putting all its chips on a single partner, maybe you understand how fragile even the best arrangements really are. My personal take? Sometimes the quietest alliances are the ones that actually last. Sometimes building for resilience is more radical than chasing growth. And sometimes the future belongs to the countries that don't panic when everyone else is freaking out. If you made it this far, thank you. The House of L is for people who think twice, who question their own assumptions, and who know that the world's biggest shifts usually happen without asking for permission first. If you want more of this, do check out these other videos that I've linked here as a natural next step for a deeper dive. If this made you think differently about something, hit subscribe. Your curiosity is what keeps this channel going. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.